chapters. Lester Brown started his career as a New Jersey farmer, worked for the USDA as an international agricultural analyst, and eventually found the Earth Policy Institute, a nonprofit focused on achieving an environmentally sustainable economy. Now, his latest book is World on the Edge: How to Prevent Environmental and Economic Collapse. Lester, great to have you here with us. You know, Adam and Dom just kind of set the backdrop in terms of pricing and how that impacts the developed versus the emerging economy. In terms of higher prices, we haven't seen the worst of it yet, have we?
Well, it looks as though the already tight food situation may get tighter in the months ahead. We have a series of converging trends here that are driving prices up. This is not just an event-driven rise in prices, though obviously the heat wave and the loss of production in Russia is contributing. We have on the demand side of the equation population growth. 219,000 people at the dinner table tonight who were not there last night. That comes to 80 million a year. We have rising affluence. There are probably 3 billion people in the world now who are trying to move up the food chain, consuming more grain-intensive livestock products. And then thirdly, we're converting grain into oil, i.e. ethanol, on a huge scale in the United States. We harvested 400 million tons of grain last year. 119 million tons of that went to ethanol distilleries to provide fuel for cars.
Right.
So these are the demand trends that are driving the demand for grain up at record rates worldwide.
As far as supply, a lot of people come on this show and say one of the big problems is the U.S. Congress has mandated a certain amount of ethanol goes into fuel for purposes that are ostensibly good, for green purposes, and yet it's eating up the food supply of grains to be used in gasoline. Is that a problem that we should fix?
Well, what we're actually doing in the United States is we're subsidizing the conversion of grain into ethanol, creating grain shortages and driving up food prices. So whether we look at it as taxpayers or consumers, we're hurting ourselves here. And I think at the end of this year, when the ethanol subsidy will be ending, we need to think about whether it should be extended or not. And my sense is that it shouldn't be.
Is it still though an issue that's pushed by people concerned about climate change? Because it seems like you're cutting off your nose to spite your face here. I mean, if we can solve the climate change issue, but so many people die because they can't get enough food, it doesn't really make sense, does it?
Well, it's not even clear that it's doing that much on the climate front. When you look at the amount of oil we use in our oil-based agriculture, and then you look at either the coal or the natural gas used to run the ethanol distilleries, there's not really much, if any gain in cutting carbon emissions. So the climate issue is not there. It's the question is the basic economics of food supply that we need to decide this issue on.
You know, Lester, we're having a pretty calm conversation, but Matt and I have been, going through your book here that you just put out, World on the Edge: How to Prevent Environmental and Economic Collapse. The chapters are terrifying: falling water tables, shrinking harvests, eroding soils, rising temperatures. You talk about environmental refugees, the emerging politics of food scarcity, mounting stresses, failing states. Like I said, we're having a pretty calm conversation. Tell me how bad the situation is because of these demand-supply metrics kind of colliding with one another.
Yeah, well, we have, on the supply side, we have climate change. The rule of thumb among crop ecologists is that for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature, almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit, we get a 10% decline in grain yields. We saw that rather dramatically in Russia this past summer. And then we have water shortages. Water shortages are spreading rapidly now. In fact, in countries that contain half the world's people, water tables are falling as a result of overpumping for irrigation. You can overpump in the short run, but not in the long run. And what we, in effect, have been creating in a number of situations is water-based food bubbles. That is, food bubbles based on overpumping. And those bubbles are starting to burst most dramatically in Saudi Arabia, but we'll also see this in India and China and other major food-producing countries.
Lester, let me ask you, I mean, when I was in college, the big concern of the day was overpopulation. We didn't get the explosive growth that everybody was so concerned about at the time, but you know, there are a heck of a lot of people on this planet. I look at the picture on the background behind you, and you can just see people stuffed into city after city after city. Is it possible that there are just too many people on this planet for us to expect a sustainable food system?
Well, we're having trouble feeding the existing population that'll hit 7 billion sometime later this year. It takes a lot of water, it takes a lot of land, and it takes a lot of skilled farmers. And we really are pushing the water and the land issues now. And it's quite possible that we have passed peak irrigation water within the last few years. I say quite possible because the data are not complete enough to enable us to say that. But we worry about peak oil, but we may already have passed peak water. If so, it's going to be more difficult to expand production rapidly in the years ahead.
So, you know, Lester, you write here, the situation the world faces now is even more urgent than the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009. What can we do, or what needs to be done to ward off such a crisis in your view?
I think we've got to take the climate issue on head on and cut carbon emissions fast. I think we've got to look at the population issue. I mean, the interesting thing is that there are 215 million women in the world today who want to plan their families, but who don't have access to family planning services. It would only cost this much to fill that gap. I mean, that would get lost in the rounding of the U.S. defense budget, for example. And these are not women who need to be persuaded. They want to plan their families, and their families represent over 1 billion people. We need to fill that family planning gap, for example.
Lester, we have 20 seconds left. In terms of a crisis situation, just quickly, what's the scenario that you could foresee? Just quickly.
A lot depends on this year's harvest. It's going to take at least a 100 million ton increase over last year. That's 5% just to maintain the status quo. That is the current unsatisfactorily high level of prices. To get things back to normal would take a 150 million ton increase. I don't think we're going to get that. I think we're going to be in a scramble mode for some time to come on the food front.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Very interesting read. Lester, thank you so much. Lester Brown of the Earth Policy Institute.